Thank you for joining us today. Our topic today is on overcoming the challenge of role explosion with attribute-based access control. Good day to everyone. My name is Kelly Shelton. I'm with Axiomatics, and I'm your host for today's event. So without further ado, let me introduce our expert speakers for today's session. First of all, we have Finn Frisch from Axiomatics. Finn is our VP of Business Development here, where he collaborates on the strategic product direction and marketing for the Axiomatics product lines. Finn brings a wealth of experience to Axiomatics, ranging from enterprise security, privacy, identity and access management, and product development. Finn is joined by Srijit Nair, who is the product manager here at Axiomatics, where he is responsible for the vision, planning, and design around the core products of Axiomatics. He also brings great knowledge to the team, including an understanding of security issues related to virtualization and the cloud-based delivery model. He's done advanced studies on information flow control, policy enforcement, applied cryptography, and general system security. So you'll be in excellent hands today with these two experts. And with that, I'll turn it over to Finn and to Srijit to get us started.
Well, thank you, Kelly, for this overwhelming introduction. And hello, Srijit. Nice to be with you in a chat room, although not physically. You're in Amsterdam and I am in Stockholm. We may better say that so people understand if there's a gap every now and then. How's Amsterdam?
It's all good, Finn. It's actually pretty sunny, surprisingly.
Oh, that's weird because here it's raining nails. So if you hear nails in the background, it's because I'm close to window and it's raining a lot. Okay, so today's webinar will focus on role explosion problems a lot, and we'll look a bit at from where all these roles come, and we'll make a note of the importance of taking small steps when you start if you switch to ABAC, which we'll see, which we'll examine to see if it's a good model sort of to deal with these many roles. We'll also look at an example. I thought before we start, so when we prepared this webinar, these were sort of some of the questions that came around. What we see in the IT landscapes around is a lot of change. We see use the cloud, big data, all these trends that make authorization to a totally different story in today's IT landscapes. So, and problems are coming out of that. We're beginning to feel at some points that the existing role-based access control models that we're using may become more of a problem than a solution to authorization problems. So the question then is, can we get more dynamic with attributes? That's what we'll look at a bit. And mind you, ABAC, attribute-based access control, does not replace role-based access control. We'll look at ways of sort of rather enhancing it. And we'll also focus on the importance of starting with small steps. So that's just about what we had discussed before, Sridhar. Do you agree?
Yes, Finn. Yeah, those I guess are the prime kind of talking points and the takeaways from this webinar, if there's anything.
Cool. So I started with this homemade little definition of authorization. Authorization are the permissions that you need to execute an action on a given information asset under certain conditions. There may be better authorization definitions out there, but I thought that could be a good starting point. Do you agree, Sridhar?
Yeah. So yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, as you said, there are different definitions, and if you're talking to a business user, a business kind of analyst, you have one way of defining authorization. Technically, it becomes a different definition when you start implementing it. And within the kind of the second side to the same coin is the fact that it's clubbed together almost always with authentication, and authentication and authorization are kind of go hand in hand, but it's important to differentiate between them. Authentication, as most of us know and clearly understand, is the process of verifying or proving who you are based on a password or biometric information. But that is the first part of the whole process. The second part, once you've done with authentication, is what the core topic of this webinar is, the authorization part, because once you have proven who you are, you get certain entitlements or properties that you can define and decide what you can do within a system, and that's where authorization kicks in. And that's a good example, a perfect example, a definition for use within our webinar.
Right, yes, and for those in the audience who are familiar with Axiomatics, you know that we are very much into attribute-based access control, and then, of course, we assume that the authentication part has already been taken care of when we come to a customer site. We totally have a separation in the logical separation between authentication and authorization. So if we step back a bit and think about why do we at all bother about authorization, it becomes quite clear that probably no one will do that just for fun, except possibly Sridhar and I. Normal people would probably avoid it. The reason that we at all bother about authorization is that we have sensitive information that we need to protect. So by nature, this by definition sort of lives in the area of governance and risk and compliance management. I mean, if we investigate this more clearly, and if we sort of look at our experiences talking to our customers, we clearly can see that on the one hand, there's a business perspective on authorization coming out of the GRC sort of realm. It is important sort of to have them aligned with primary business objectives. And mind you, the business objectives are very, very different. Sort of, you know, the internal control objectives in financial reporting is what drives the bank, perhaps the information security at the bank. Whereas if you go to a, say, law enforcement state agency, they probably don't care too much about the financial reporting, but more about confidentiality for other reasons. So it will differ with the organization. The business perspective is high level and general, whereas if we switch to the technical perspective, it is typically very much aligned with the technical infrastructure. It's very detailed and very specific. These two different perspectives we find, I'd say, over and over as two separate sort of trains of thought in the organizations that we work with. Wouldn't you agree, Sridhar?
Yes, you're spot on, Finn. I mean, and one of the things that I've encountered when I talk to potential customers is that wherever there is kind of a mismatch between the business perspective and authorization, however it is defined, if it is mismatched with the technical perspective, there is always a friction that's developed when you talk about authorization and the capabilities and what you actually want to do with authorization within the system. And the closer you are aligned from a business perspective to the technical implementation, the more synergy you get. And it's becomes so much more easier to start from a business objective of authorization, for example, securing financial data or personal identifying information, and actually enforcing it in a way that makes sense from a business and a technical point of view.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I'd go further as well to say that if we compare these perspectives, in many ways, the business perspective on authorization today is often quite generic and high level, and also to a certain extent poorly documented. I've been talking with former colleagues of mine who are auditors and IT auditors, and they constantly sort of complain about this, whereas the technical perspective, on the other hand, is comparatively much better documented. You have lots of details. The problem just being that it's very system specific and difficult to analyze because you have so many sources of information. But in the end, if you come as an auditor into the organization and say, I want to find out who can do what in these systems, they are able typically to, perhaps after some time, to generate the necessary reports and tell you this is how it works. When you then take that report and go and ask, well, why do you have those authorizations? Then the business perspective may be a bit weaker. And I think, Sridhar, you travel a lot and see a lot of our customers. Would you agree that is the case also among our...
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, definitely. Because one often seen thing is that when we start talking, it's usually to the technical folks and the technical implementation side of things. One of the core first questions we typically ask is, what is the the source of this technical implementation of a rule or a permission. And oftentimes it's very, very hard to go back and say, okay, this was the business case or the business objective which we codified in this technical implementation. And the fact that you can't do it is actually a worrying thing. It points to the fact, as Finn, you mentioned here, is that the business perspective are typically poorly documented, generic, a lot of times resides in people's heads. They are very high level, and oftentimes that to the technical perspective. So in order to get a good authorization flow, it's important to kind of connect the dots between these two different silos in a way.
Right. Yes, and I think that's when you and I talked before this webinar. I think that's sort of one of the important points and takeaways, that it will become increasingly important as we move forward to join these two perspectives and ideally make one of them.
Mm-hmm.
so that, yeah. Okay. So, but today's topic was really then about the role explosion, and that is a in most organizations at regular intervals, namely between audits or around audits. Many organizations, in my perception, have a tendency to sort of live from audit to audit and hope to avoid risk thereby. So what happens during the audit is very often sort of that surprisingly big new gaps come around. And these new gaps, that is sort of inevitable in the system of the audit itself, because the auditing part is not an exact science. And if we look at good auditing practices that strive to provide a fair and clear view sort of the situation of the company, those do contain a rather large portion of subjectivity. It's the collecting all this data and analyzing it. And as such, then you may get sort of different views. And in getting these different views, you may also all of a sudden discover risk that you have in your current system that you were not aware of. And these risks then call for quite radical change. So, for instance, if we were in a situation like this where we 2014 thought like everything was okay, the new auditor may discover the obvious. Now, I would assume most organizations have discovered this, so this is more for fun. But let's say we had the typical example of the vendor management and creating the purchase order. The new auditor will probably say, that. But this movement from audit to audit, is that something that you recognize from your conversations with our customers as well? It's really...
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of times when you talk to auditors and people who work in that area, they emphasize the fact that you have to do audits. But what the curious thing though is that most of the big data breaches and most of the fundamental break-ins and the insider threat manifests itself in between those two audits. So audits is kind of taken as kind of the last, I wouldn't call it the last line of defense, but it's a strong line of defense. But that happens once in a year or so, and that just doesn't hold water beyond a point. And Phil,
Right.
you had this interesting conversation with an auditor friend of yours where role explosion part and why it's so important from their perspective.
Right. Yeah. So in essence, if we look at the procedures, so typically what happens if we get into this situation, we have these different roles. In our example, we have 2 roles and we have 3 groups of people. The one in the middle sort of has been assigned both roles and has permissions in both areas. Typically, I mean, the ideal way in an audit, you start with analyzing all these permissions that have been assigned, and you define typically out of a rule set that should come out of the negotiations with ideally with the board in the company, right, where we define this is our risk matrix or our SOD matrix, and here are the risks that we cannot tolerate. And this slide, this image is from a real audit. And as you can see, we have 13 people, for instance, who are able to do service entry and release, and they're marked red because they can also create and release a purchase order. High risk in that company, something that you need to deal with. And in doing so, you end up with a tricky situation. So let's say now, let's go back to our obvious. The XK01 code is the transaction code out of a SAP system. So this is probably familiar to those of you who are familiar with SAP environments. So we have the vendor management and the purchase order. Those were sort of lethal to combine for one and the same person, we've decided. What happens, of course, is that the people assigned the role 1 are innocent. they are not hit by this conflict, and those assigned only to role 2 the same. But those in the middle, they cause a severe problem for us now. Now let's say the people in the middle say, fine, take away the XK01 permission because we don't really need it. Then the other people in role 1 will complain because they need it. So if they say, we'll take the other one away, then the people in role 2 will complain. So we get this constant renegotiation after each audit, and we'll have to sort of remodel. And this situation will, of course, end up with the situation where we divide role 1 and role 2, both where this conflict is not entailed, and then we can take these new roles and assign to the people in the middle to resolve it. And I mean, that's the root cause from a technical perspective, seemingly, for the role explosion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But from the business level, one could also add that this is very much due to the fact that we approach this in this technical level. So we have auditors come in and examining on a technical level how we're doing. So taking our measuring the temperature in our systems, and then we do something about it, rather than sort of thinking about the true root cause of the business rule, which is something else. So in a way, sometimes you get the question, so what's the elevator pitch for ABAC? And I am lazy, so every now and then I take the elevator in our office building. In that elevator, we have the image here to the right. Most of you can probably not read this because it's in Swedish, but it's a warning sign within the elevator that says that if you're traveling with a barrel like this, watch out, because there's no inner door in the elevator, so bad things may happen, as the right picture sort of shows. And that reminds me a bit of experiences I've had as an IT auditor in the past. You stand there and think everything is just fine, and all of a sudden you realize it's not. And to a certain extent, the elevator pitch then for authorization is a bit that if we focus too much on roles, we may hide the real danger, because instead of handling the risks, we start handling roles. And if we don't properly handle the risks, we may have some quite nasty experiences in our elevator. Mm-hmm. So
that's a pretty appropriate summation of the problems, and it's basically that the role is a kind of a symptom or a manifestation of the root cause, which is most likely the risk and a business risk or a technical risk associated within your information system.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So possibly we should demand that this little sign is there because there's a legal constraint on people who operate elevators in Sweden. They have to have this warning sign. Perhaps we need to have a warning like that on authorization systems as well. Okay, so how bad does it get? We have some examples here, and I think some of these come come from your experiences talking to various clients, I think, Sridit. So the first one is a financial institution far away from me in Stockholm. They had 7,000 wholesale customers. That was in so obviously a customer-facing interface, right?
Yeah, it is basically a wholesale enterprise per section of the bank, and yeah, it's 7,000 wholesale customer, which is not too big, not too small, but look at the number of roles they have to manage them. 93,000 roles for managing 7,000 customers within the institution.
So that's, yeah. So it's not a very fun and symptom, right? But another example here that is from a large, very large, and we should say, energy company. The name you all would know, but still, although they are large, this is too much. They have 50 people working full time, and that's to do nothing but resolving SOD conflicts in one of their ERP systems.
Yeah, I think it's important to notice that even though we haven't mentioned it, it's actually just one of the ERP systems. It's not the whole energy company as a whole. It's just one ERP system within one geography.
So it seems something has gone wrong if our ERP systems require that sort of background support in order to survive, then things have gone radically wrong in our authorization infrastructure. The third example, I think, was something you mentioned recently,
Yeah,
Sridit, right?
indeed. It was one of the potential customers we were talking to, and while we were having a conversation, one of the people there mentioned that they have a single system that were about 3,000 roles. So on its own, it's not that big compared to what they have in other sections, but it was kind of showing its age. So they brought in external consultants to figure out how many of those are actually needed, and they figured out that about 80% of them were either redundant or no longer used. There's nobody associated with that role, but it's still there. It's still consuming resources. It's consuming audit times. It's consuming technical implementation, writing capabilities, and everything. And they brought it down after further analysis. But given time, it's just going to go back to what it is, because that's the nature of the beast in a way. Roles
The never-ending
explode.
Sudoku.
Indeed, back to the same old, same old.
Right. Okay, so Sridit, we've been whining enough. What to do is then our next section, and I think if you drive us through this.
Sure thing, Finn. So as we have seen, one of the core things that we have been trying to impress upon is the fact that you cannot take audit or compliance as kind of isolated, standalone, once in a year kind of process. Rather, the whole governance aspect should be taken as a continuous process. So instead of doing from jumping from one audit to other and firefighting the day before or a couple of days before the audit process, it should be taken as a adaptive, dynamically changing need that needs to focus more on what we call the rules and not roles, because at the end of it, what you need to do is implement actual business policies related to security. So the focus should not be on the technical assignment of permissions to roles, but rather it should be on the enforcement and implementation of the policies, which starts, of course, their life as business policies, but at the end of it, it becomes system and IT policies, and specifically authorization policies. So it's going to become a continuum rather than disjoint, standalone processes.
Right. Okay. So if we go back to the example.
Yeah, so if you go back to the example that you mentioned where we had this case where there was a segregation of duty conflict and the explosion of role to handle that, if you look at it fundamentally, what you're trying not to do here is to prevent any vendor from creating any purchase order, or a person who is doing a vendor creation from doing a purchase order. Because at the end of it, if you trace back, as I said, mentioned before, the technical rule that you're trying to implement to the business requirement, what you want to do is to make sure that there's no single user or end kind of insider who can corrupt a business critical process, in this case a purchase order, a vendor approval kind of process. So what that actually means is to make sure that there's no user who can create a new vendor XYZ and then of course register a purchase order for that specific vendor, because it's a classic insider threat, a classic exploitation of loose authorization rules. So that is what you're trying to prevent. You're not trying to prevent the inclusive case of anybody being able to do anything. So if you start with that and then look at it as to how you can enrich it with fine-grained authorization. So if you start with a user who's authorized to edit master data to the creator vendor should not be able to add a role, to not be given a role that gives permission to create a purchase order. So that's how you would tackle it from a pure role-based access control model, the same thing that you wanted to do. But when it comes to attribute-based or the more fine-grained authorization model, it turns out you can do it much more simply and much more elegantly, where you say that whenever a user creates a purchase order, you need to make sure that the person involved is not the one who has created or modified or edited specific details about the vendor. So if he has, it means there is a SOD violation and you deny the request to actually create the purchase order, otherwise you permit. So it is a real-time runtime process interception level implementation of the rule. It uses fine-grained authorization, and it's not a priori before the fact creation of roles that prevent the SOD violation.
Mm-hmm. And you know, Sri, I think this is an interesting example because it really points to the static nature of RBAC versus the dynamic nature of attribute-based access control, since it is, and I think you'll show us very soon now, how you at runtime really do sort of check these various attributes, right, rather than pre-assign them to users.
Indeed, yeah, and that makes it a much more flexible in a way as well.
Yeah. There's one other aspect that I think is important to remember as well. I've used this picture a lot in webinars. Perhaps people have seen this before. We see this radical change in IT landscapes, and it moves very fast. People move into the cloud, hybrid, public-private clouds. We see users go mobile. They use their tablets, their mobile phones, what have you, to do things that you couldn't do before. And then all of a sudden, if I have this application that was built once upon a time, that had one type of user interface, which I could reach from within the office. If that same application all of a sudden gets an API connected so that tablet users can reach it at any time from any place, then of course that access, it's not obvious that the same user coming via the tablet and the cloud should have the same permissions as that user had before. So if the RBAC model was enough before, it may become difficult when we need to start looking at the many authorization decisions that we need to make in these many different scenarios. And these are the scenarios where I think we really see the number of roles going bananas in recent times. So on this slide, sort of, if we think about it, the permission set X was given to someone to do during normal business hours from within the local area network. So that was the role one that we started with. And then we open up. So then we want people to be able to use the same service after business hours. That would then have to be a new role in a role concept if we don't have an attributes anyway sort of to enrich the roles, right? And then other channels. If we come from a mobile device, yet another set of limitations. If we come via this or that channel, yet another set of limitations, and so on. And I think the example that you mentioned before, Sridhar, with the, what was it, 93,000 roles for 7,000 wholesale customers. Yeah. I would assume some of these effects are in there, that one and the same user may have to be assigned a lot of roles to cater for the many different sort of entry points that have become possible in our new, very connected IT landscapes, right?
Yeah, that's right, indeed. It's just a guess, but it most likely is the obvious reason to do it. It's just catering to the ever-growing demands of how people interact with systems, how people work within a network environment. And so if you look at it from a pure policy and rule point of view, what you basically at the end exploit is the fact that there are attributes, what you can kind of consider it as properties of the systems or the environment that uniquely define what you actually going to work your policies against. So instead of creating new roles which tries to cater to all different possible permutations and combinations of possible scenarios, what you do is you write your policies and augment your policies as and when time requires you to do it with essential properties of the interaction system. So if you have a new channel and you want to say you can do XYZ on if you're using that new channel, so the process basically is to have a policy and rule which says permit users with these properties. They are managers, they are from location United States, who can perform actions, say read, write, edit, whatever, uh, and on data type, purchase orders or transactions, informations, and so on within these contexts. So you can basically say something like a user X belonging to this region can edit this purchase order if he is between 9 and 5 working hours. If not, he has to be physically having extra properties like he has done two-factor authentication and things like that. So it becomes easier to kind of enrich your policies by exploiting more properties associated with the channel that you have in consideration to write your policies against.
Right. Okay. So in essence, if we had the policy approach, we could say if we have the role X and the permissions that it give, we could create a policy that matches sort of this role. But then when we need to enhance that role, we don't need to create new policies. We just add little conditions, right? So we could say permit the user to do X. Provided that, and if
Exactly.
not, then, and so on, right?
Yeah,
So we add these conditions, and so the one single policy with conditions added can easily then cater for hundreds of roles, right?
indeed. Yeah, and a lot of times they are much more kind of easier to understand logically, kind of structured. So it's not too hard to expand as the time requires or the condition requires you
Mm-hmm.
to.
Yeah. Okay, I see we have a typo here on this slide, so we'll quickly go to the next slide before people notice. Um, So again, we've been whining, and we say then that change is needed. We cannot continue to do authorization the way we've done. And then the question is, do we have a business case to motivate change? And that, of course, very much depends on the situation an organization is in. I found this quotation very interesting. This is from a book that I read recently, which I would recommend to anyone who has an SAP system. Authorizations in SAP software design and configuration by Volker Lehnert, Katharina Bonit, and Larry Justice. And they make a very sort of start with a holistic view and go into all the various details in that environment. Anyway, they conclude that the expense for authorization sub-projects is between 10 and 15% of the overall scope for any project. And otherwise, the costs for retroactive cleansing processes, that's what you mentioned before, I think, Sridhar, and maintenance costs, they are considerably higher than these costs. A poorly set up authorization concept can incur significant additional costs in an upgrade project. So I think that is sort of your 80% example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is something like that. And we have seen from other customers, I remember we had last year a pre-study from a large bank in the US where they had for different types, they had typed their different, classified their different projects and came up with figures for the authorization. And they ranged between 10% was sort of the lower end and up to 40 and even more percent as size of the effort for authorization. And of course, then we have in general the thing that a change very often becomes needed due to a policy change or a new legal regulation. We had, for instance, one of our customers is a bank that was struck by the fact that in one of the countries that they operate, a privacy regulation changed. And as a result, they had to change their IT systems. Now this change becomes very painful if you already went into production. This slide shows in general how the cost, the relation of between implementing change at an early stage while you're still sort of planning software versus retrofitting change into a system in production, right? And this is something that very often is true to changes that are caused by GRCs or requirements changing. You have to do it on your production system, and it becomes 30 times more costly than doing it early on, according to this study. The figures here are from an old study that Microsoft. I think it's probably 6 years ago now, so these figures may have changed somewhat, but it shows sort of the relation between the pain, right? So the question should perhaps be turned around. With the ABAC shift, can you afford not to change, right? Yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
Street.
yes,
I
you
guess
said it,
take
Finn.
it.
And I think if you
Go ahead.
go ahead, Finn.
No, I just said I got so carried away that we had a few other things that we wanted to say in between. I'll hand it over to you.
No,
So
no, go ahead.
let's.
So if you actually kind of look at where we are headed and what people have predicted, you can see one of the often quoted statistics or prediction in a way is from Gartner. And what they say is that they're seeing around 5% of businesses and enterprises using ABAC as their predominant mechanism for authorization, but they see a steep increase in that number, almost to about 70% by 2020, and that's a huge number, and it kind of reflects the reality of the fact that role-based access control is hitting the limits on what it can do without causing more pain to the system in general. And
Right.
that kind of includes most of the organizations that we talk to as well.
By the way, we were lazy. We didn't update this slide. This year, in 2015, Gartner updated this to say 35% of enterprises will have reached this by 2018. So it's getting
That's a
hot.
big number. Yeah, that's a big number and a huge steep increase indeed. Yeah.
So Sridhar, now you have to explain how we get there.
Uh, we will get there. Now the question is how, and one of the things that we have kind of proposed throughout the webinar and oftentimes before that is the use of what we call attribute-based access control, the ABAC that you saw in a couple of slides before. The concept is very simple. The idea is that you use attributes, or some would call it properties, of the system or the resources or the people who are involved in the system to write your policies again. So you basically, instead of classifying people into roles and adding permissions to those roles, saying this role can do that and say Alice belongs to that role, you basically say a manager who is located in this part of the world can do XYZ on this resource given time of the day, for example. So basically you write your policies against attributes which are easy to understand, which is logical to think about from a business point of view, and easy to implement and fetch from a technical point of view. So in this example, and there's a great example of why we emphasize the fact that ABAC is real time and it's not kind of a priori authorization concept, is that when an access is requested, say in this case by a user to read or edit record number 22, the record can be anything. It could be a database record, it could be a file or whatever. The way it works is the access is intercepted. All the information about that access is gathered as much as possible within the context of the application in this case, and it's sent to an externalized or a coupled authorization service which describes what can be allowed for based on what conditions. So in this case, it says something like permit managers who have these properties to do XYZ on this resource, in this case, it could be record number 22. So if all these conditions that the policies are written against are met by that specific request that's coming in, you allow the request to go through, so you return a permit. If any of those conditions are not met, for example, the person is not based out of Sweden or based out of the United States, you do not allow that access to go through, and then the interception point basically blocks the access. And you can also see the round things at the bottom of the picture. Those are called the attribute sources. Now, that's a very interesting extension that you can add into the system, because you could not always be getting all the attributes that you want from the get-go of the request. So you could say, for example, know the user ID of the person, but not the role. So the good thing about authorization services is that it can hook up to externalized systems and consume this external attribute sources. So an LDAP directory, for example, would have the role or the organization structure, so it could actually gather the fact that he's a manager or is based out of a specific geographic location and enrich the context of the policy evaluation. So you can see why we claim that attribute-based access control is fine-grained, it's dynamic, it's flexible, and it's real-time, and it makes expanding and writing more complex policies easier in a way.
Right. Yeah, so this is sort of the schema of the reference architecture really of the standard hexagonal base on which this is based. Now, if we look at this, there we have sort of not the authorization architecture, but the information architecture, right? So how they play together.
Yeah, it's the any depth defense in depth kind of approach. You want to protect your data and your business tier applications and your presentation tier, and you want to do it independent, but also all of them talking about the same policies, deciding based on the same policy. So the good thing about the approach that we showed, the architecture we showed before, is that the interception point can be anywhere in your tiers. It can be at the data tier all the way up to the presentation or even the SSO tier. And all of them can evaluate against the same authorization policy and the rule, providing each one of them have their own attributes that it can talk about. So at the URL level, you might be talking about somebody can access /admin URL. At the data level, you will have a different policy saying, yeah, fine, you did go through /admin, but you are only administrator of that part of the data and not this part. So you can have different kind of layers of policies that you can write against.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so you can see that when you go from ABAC, RBAC to ABAC, you see a shift from coarse-grained, role-based, where many users become part of one single role, to a more fine-grained approach where things are basically expressed as attributes. So attributes of users and attributes of resources. Typically, we talk about the attributes of the user resource, the action, and the environment, say the IP address, the time of the day, and so on. So that's the kind of approach we have been pushing towards and making people understand the flexible nature and the easier nature of modeling using that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then we come to the difficult question, because in the end, this sort of has authorization is not something that you sort of easily put somewhere in the corner. It's very much embedded in your infrastructure, and you often then sort of get to the point where people say, well, shall we rip out the heart of our infrastructure? Which doesn't seem to be a very good idea. So I think perhaps one of the more important things is on the benefits of starting small, right?
Yeah, definitely, because small accomplishes a couple of things. It makes it easier to people to adapt to the new way of thinking. It also makes it less critical when you start from the beginning, because you are kind of learning from scratch some of the new concepts. So it's good to start from a new application or an application which has got a limited scope, limited user base, and learn the lessons of moving that small application into the next stage, and then use that knowledge that you have gained, basically.
Right, and to a certain extent, Sridhar, I would say this is also a way to preserve your existing role-based access control model, because all of a sudden it becomes possible if we add more dynamic features on top of our a bit too static roles, we can help make use of those roles for a longer time, right? So it's also a way of enhancing what we have, enabling us to grow with what we have until we sort of have done a more thorough shift, would you say?
Absolutely.
And if we look at our customers, so typically we see, for instance, the small tree to the left could, for instance, then be solving the one situation where we have, for instance, companies struggle with export control regulations. They're tricky because you need to take into account the citizenship of users, their locations, and what have you, all sorts of things that are difficult to cater for in a role-based system. Now, very often then, they already have their data management in role-based systems. And then they add attribute-based access control on top of that to cater, for instance, for the question, what was the citizenship, right? Or the privacy case that we talked about before in the bank in the Nordics. Well, the roles are still there, but they use the attributes to cater, for instance, for things in the new regulation says, for instance, that customers should be able to blacklist specific employees. So then the attributes, blacklists attributes, becomes a part of the top layer, namely the attributes that sort of protect the old authorization mechanism that you have in your application from before, right?
Yeah, indeed.
And I think, so to round up, where are we time-wise? We have an example. Yes, we'll still have time for that.
Yes, we do. Yeah, and that's a good example of why we need to move beyond what we have doing right now.
Yeah, and it shows this starting small, I think. So this is based a bit on a insurance company, a customer of ours. They did, I think they started about 1.5 or 2 years ago. They decided they need a new customer portal. In this customer portal, they would actually expose data out of the business systems to their clients. The way they work today is that they have a role-based access control model internally. Staff members access customers' insurance policies via systems that are role-based. So the question then is, can we out there in the cloud and on the internet, can we use the same RBAC model to cater for the needs that we have on the customer portal? Can roles handle access in this portal? Now, the thing is that the business rules could entail things like, in this case, we see a mother with 2 children, a son who is not yet 18 and a daughter that is more than 18. The question then is, can the mother manage the insurance policies of the son and the daughter? Well, in the way the law is written, the legal requirements are such that for the son, yes, but for the daughter, no. And when the son turns 18, well then, the permission needs to go away. So this is difficult to capture in a role. If you were to capture these relations between the mother and her children into a role, you could easily possibly end up with the 93,000 roles in our previous example, right? So questions that they had was like here, is this user allowed to see the family, an overview of the other family members in the new portal? Is the user allowed to see the claims of family members? Or if we go to corporate client, is the corporate client's HR department allowed to see details about the employees, right, that were insured there? So technical architecture looked a bit like this. A new web portal would handle the new web interface in the middle. Also, a mobile portal was separate to handle mobile users. Then agents and partners have applications that go directly to the channel layer, to the API layer that sort of caters for the core backend systems from which they were to retrieve the data. So obviously they would need to have some type of authentication, first of all, identify the users who are coming in, and then thereafter one will need to check authorization, who can do what in these systems. Here again, then, if we revisit this problem, sort of this client of ours decided that for the external, you really need attributes. On the inside, you very well could continue with the roles. So to a certain extent, we have the same base system that is servicing sort of different user needs, and we have two different layers of authorization systems. So the roles are still granting access to customer details for the staff members, whereas from the outside, we have this policy-based approach where we take into account the relations. So if the subject is the mother, and we have these data classifications on the policies, and the data subject is the son, and the device channel via which the mother is coming, well, then perhaps permit or deny or whatever. So you can have these very rich policies there. And this, I think, is sort of a very good example of how we don't rip out the roles, but when a new use case comes around, we're able to enhance our existing RBAC system with attributes to do more. So this is a bit how the architecture looks today. You have the web application firewall, you have the API gateway down there, and on all of these different places within the infrastructure, we see these little traffic lights, the policy enforcement points that go query the authorization engine in this case. I think we clearly can see that role-based access control, which has been such a dominant model for authorization, we obviously can see that there are challenges as we move into the 21st century and the new business scenarios and the new IT landscapes. We believe then that attributes and policies offer more dynamic and flexible methods. Yet, and the next item though is important, attribute-based access control should not replace role-based access control, but rather enhance it. It enables you to sort of leverage the investment that you already made. And then again, of course, like with any identity and access management project, start small and grow. Sridhar, did I forget anything here?
Yeah, I think in the next slide, what we wanted to show was that the fact that fine-grained authorization can most precisely address the targeted risk. So you can basically start small and add new conditions and then create more authentication strength and relational data of the subjects. So you basically add new logics to the conditions of the policy rather than expand the original role-based concept. And that's what we have in the next slide. And the policy-driven authorization basically helps shift in a way from the kind of the symptoms of and implementation specific details to the core objective or the control objective, which is basically to preserve the security of whatever you're protecting, and that becomes easier when you use a policy-driven approach to this thing.
Right. Yeah. And this the last thing I think perhaps may even be something that we forget because we're pretty technically geeky very often, but I think this is a very important thing, the shifting away from the role perspective to the rule perspective, because that sort of makes the important change. Why are we doing this in the first place? Well, we have risk, and that's what we want to address, right? Okay, I think we're done. Thank you all for listening, and we'll hand over back to you, Kelly.
Great. Thanks, Finn and Sridhar, for the great presentation. We've got a few questions that have come here through the chat window, or the questions window, rather. So I will just encourage anybody who has a question for the presenters, go ahead and submit them. And we're going to hop right to it here because we have some good ones that have come through. So the first question here, so will this ABAC approach help me eliminate some of the roles in use today?
Okay, yeah. Sridhar?
Yeah, so as we said, it definitely will help you eliminate some of the roles and especially the redundant ones. But as we have been trying to kind of say, it should not be the primary objective of removing role-based access control from the system completely and kind of dismantling the infrastructure you have in place, but to augment it. But the side effect of using that, of course, would be that the redundant roles, the roles that you created to, say, SOD violations, those can be eliminated to a large extent.
Right, and what I think we could add is that what you definitely could eliminate is the need to create even more roles.
Indeed,
right?
yes.
By enhancing them. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, very good. So here's another question that's asking about the scenario that you guys talked about on slides 31 and 32. This is a resource question. So accessing the authorization service to check permissions for every resource, would this make the service a big bottleneck? And how would you avoid that or make sure that's not the case?
Very interesting performance question. Yes, indeed. And there I think we can divide this into two sections. Number one, actually asking the authorization service to get a permit or deny. That's a no-brainer. There we clearly can see that does not consume much overhead at all. So that is very, very fast. Now, if you then start querying external authorization attribute sources, then of course, if we were in every request to go out, search Google to find out something, then we add overhead, right? So from an architectural point of view, during a deployment project, you typically need to consider where do your attributes live, and can you ensure that they are readily there for you. Very often you end up with different caching scenarios or what have you. The products that Axiomatic provide, of course, include caching capabilities. Would you like to add to that, Sridhar?
Yes, and there is another angle to the same question as well. So it could also be related to the fact that, say you're protecting a web portal and your user is logged in, and you're going to ask hundreds of questions or tens of questions about each aspect of the UI or the menu and so on. And are you going to ask them 10 times separately? What can you do to minimize that kind of question? So are you going to explode the number of questions in a way? And there are multiple ways of handling it. One is what the standard called the multiple decision capability. So you bundle up multiple questions about the similar kind of resource, kind of stable. It's valid for a particular period of time. So you could ask, can he access A, B, C, and D as individual questions, but you bundle it together and ask the PDP. So your round trip time from the interception point to the authorization service is one time rather, and the decisions of course have to be calculated separately, but most of us, the systems that are in the market and especially ours as well, have pretty good performance, so that will never be a bottleneck at that point really. And
Pretty
then you
good,
look
I'd
at
say.
it at that level.
You say pretty good, I'd say very, very good. I mean,
Very good, yes.
so the use cases that our solution caters for includes requirements like we have one customer that has 200 million users accessing systems every day. We are sort of in the trading services at investment banks where they count milliseconds of delays, right? So it's a proven technology that really stands for a lot, right?
Yep.
Very good. Well,
Also,
I'm going to give you guys a couple more questions here. I know we're at the top of the hour, but I think these two are really good. So the next question, can I apply ABAC to all of my existing role-based applications?
definitely not. I hope you agree with me, Rick, but I'd say,
I
let's
can
say
see your point.
I have spent $500 million to invest in a huge ERP system, and this ERP system is role-based. Not only is it role-based, it's role-based in a very, very good way. It's a good system, and it does what I want in many ways. I have the hassle of constant sort of remodeling my roles, yes, but in essence, I'm not going to rip out the core, the heart of this very expensive investment to try to replace it with something else, I'd say. But what you definitely can and must do is to enhance it. So if we have this ERP system, the internal authorization we keep, of course, and we'll probably keep it for a great many years still. But if we connect that system to our customer portal, that was, for instance, in the use case that we looked at, there was actually a system connected to that customer portal. coming in. There we cannot live with the roles. It's impossible. So there we enhance the role model, right? Would you agree with this, Tridit?
Completely, Finn. Yeah, definitely. There's no point ripping apart RBAC systems just for the sake of doing it. There needs to be a reason. There needs to be an obvious limitation, and only then. And a lot of times you do see it there and right in your face, and there those are the best use cases for you to start working with.
Mm.
Okay, very good. All right, so one more question here to close us out. So where would somebody implementing an ABAC system, where would they get the other attributes to use?
You kind of find it in a lot of different places, and that's one question we typically get as well. Do we need to start classifying all the data we have? How do we go about doing it? But at the end of it, if you look at the systems that you have in place and the attribute sources you have in place, a lot of them are already available to you, be it the LDAP directories you have, or be it the data within a database, for example, and some of SAP system can already have metadata about the content in it. So, and if you don't, of course, you have to add it, but a lot of them are already available. And the magic actually lies in identifying them and then hooking it up to the ABAC system. And that's not really a rocket science, to be very frank.
Okay, very good. Anything from you on that, Finn?
No, I think we're running over time, right? So I'll
Yeah.
try to
Okay.
shut up and just say that it would be interesting, though, to know this is what we've been talking about today is an area where we constantly keep learning. So it would be interesting to get feedback from our listeners as well. To any comments on this, don't hesitate to provide them to us.
All right. Well, thank you very much to our expert speakers. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.